All right, today we would like to welcome Daniel Poneman, or Dan Poneman, former Deputy Secretary of Energy and was it senior fellow at the Belfer Center, which is part of the
Right.
Harvard Kennedy Business School.
Harvard Kennedy School.
Harvard Kennedy School.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Right.
thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. No. I want to get to this book that you wrote, the Double Jeopardy book, because I found it to be just unbelievable. Maybe I just love it so much because it's written like a series of policy papers, which I'd love to consume. But before we do that, we always like to capture our guest's story. And so I'm going to force you to go all the way back to the beginning.
Oh dear.
How you even got involved in energy at all, and where did this interest came from? You go back as far as it takes.
Well, it's totally coincidence, of course. I wanted to be an oceanographer when I was growing up, marine biologist specifically. I loved scuba diving. But when I got to college, turns out oceanography had a lot of science, which I wasn't that great at. And I got a summer internship for my home state senator, John Glenn. And I was assigned for about the first 3 weeks to the autopen in the correspondence room downstairs.
Wait, what's an autopen?
This is when the senator receives letters. They're very authentic looking signatures, but they're actually performed by a pen that was invented by Thomas Jefferson. And so I was operating the machine that had this false signature of the senator. And this was not the most intellectually challenging activity.
You were a robot.
I was a robot. And so about 3 weeks into this, I went upstairs to the legislative director and I said, could you give me a research project? And he said, sure, like on what? And I said, anything. And he said, well, why don't you look at the NPT?
NPT, spell that out for me.
And I'll do military say November, Papa, Tango.
That's
NPT.
not what I meant.
Well, so I didn't know either. And of course, back then, 1975, there was no internet, there was no Google, there was nothing. So it took me all the rest of the afternoon in the Congressional Research Service Annex in the basement of the Russell Center office building to determine that NPT stands for Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And the reason why the senator was interested in it was in May of 1974, India had detonated a so-called peaceful nuclear explosion, and the U.S. Congress had become very upset about this.
Came up in your book, yeah.
Yeah, and so basically by that serendipity, I got interested in nuclear proliferation, and I've been working on it since 1975.
I mean, you're the world expert on it, probably.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't say that, but I'll say that.
It's a passion of mine.
So, all right, tell me how your career progressed then.
Okay, so basically it's all revolved around things nuclear. So I became very interested in my undergraduate years in European nuclear policies and why France had been so successful, whereas Germany had failed in promoting a nuclear energy policy. So that was my undergraduate thesis.
And why is that? Can you give us the quick synopsis?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically because of Napoleon.
Get out of here.
Yeah, no, that's my thesis. My thesis was in France, you had a highly centralized form of government that went back to the Napoleonic Code with the prefectures reporting up. And basically, you had a nationally determined decision by President Pompidou to go to nuclear, all nuclear. And unless you basically lived in the shadow of a cooling tower, you had no status to object.
Yeah.
And they basically drove that thing through, as you well know, to have 80% of their electricity come
Amazing,
from
I
nuclear.
know.
However, in Germany, obviously after World War II, the Allies didn't even allow the Germans to have a constitution. There was a so-called basic law. And to avoid the accretion of power to the center, which was obviously one of the hallmarks of Nazism, they divided the system into a bunch of very powerful individual states and a very powerful constitutional court. So everyone had the possibility of blocking everyone else. And so you had a lot of local protests about nuclear even then, and they got all gummed up in that process. So that was my undergraduate thesis. And then
I wish I'd read that now.
You know what? It actually stands up pretty well because a friend of mine was writing a book, Thane Gustafson, I think, was writing a book that touched on some of these issues. I pulled it out and I sent it to him. It's still...
Were you always a good writer?
No. Actually, I was a terrible writer. My view of writing in elementary and high school was you take the fewest number of thoughts and you stretch it out to the longest possible number of words so you could get up to 10 pages.
Which is the opposite of what a good writer does.
When I was a freshman in college, everyone was forced to take a course called expository writing. And I was a good student in high school. I was expecting to get good grades in college. And my first grade on my expository writing paper was a C-. And it's because of what I just told you. And so that guy, Paul Zevnik, wherever you are, thank you, he forced me to be a good writer, where I actually flipped it, where you try to get the most concise expression. And in the immortal words of Strunk and White, every word should tell.
Yeah.
And so I like writing. And I enjoy when I was just having lunch yesterday with Varun Sivaram, a great writer. He wrote Taming the Sun. And I said, apart from the analytics of he writes beautifully. So I do appreciate that. And so I have always liked writing. And then, when I went to graduate school, I had looked at the European side of the nuclear equation. So now I became interested in the other side, because there was a lot of enthusiasm in the developing world, as we then called it, in nuclear power. And the question presented even then, which I address somewhat in this book, is, do they really want the bomb, or do they just want energy?
Right.
And so that was my graduate thesis.
And the distinction between the two is the hallmark of good foreign nuclear policy.
Indeed. Yeah. And so I looked at some case studies, and that was my graduate thesis, and that became my first book, which was Nuclear Power in the Developing World, which came out in 1982.
Wow. Where were you working in 1982?
So by that time, I had just, finished at Oxford. I spent a year at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, where I wrote that book. And in 1982, I was still in law school. So I came back from writing that book, and I went to law school.
And then how did you leverage your law degree?
Well, I went to law school for the wrong reason, which is, like many people, to keep my options open, right? And so when I finished law school, I decided I did not want a judicial clerkship, but I was very interested because of their nuclear policy in Argentina. Mm-hmm. And so
I hear another book coming on.
That was my third book, because I'd become fascinated not just by the nuclear side, but because this is a country that was one of the top 10 countries in per capita income in 1930. And by the political horrors of that country, they never realized their potential. So I wrote a book on the transition to democracy, which happened just around that time.
It's crazy that even today their potential is still totally stunted.
Totally stunted. It's just, it's tragic. It's
And I was just on the phone yesterday with a nuclear engineer from Argentina, and just to hear him talk about like the level of expertise they have down there.
They do.
It's just crazy that they can't exercise that expertise to grow their economy.
Well, I'll tell you something. Since you asked this question, interesting way these conversations can go. They had a very unusual situation way back in 1950, 1951, when Juan Domingo Perón was still president. There was a refugee from Europe, Ronald Richter, who persuaded Perón that he could control fusion. Now, this is like before the first H-bomb. The first uncontrolled fusion had not happened. So Perón gives him sovereignty over a little island, Huemul Island, down near Bariloche. And he basically announced to the world that he had controlled nuclear fusion. And it was immediately, a global story. It was in the New York Times, and then it was immediately exposed as fraudulent.
Right.
So to sort of get out of that penalty box, they actually ended up creating a very professional organization driven out of the Navy that actually became a very serious nuclear organization.
Is that INVAP? Or
INVAP came out of that.
INVAP came out of that.
Yeah. The actual organization was called the CONEA, the Comisión Nacional de Energía Atómica, the Atomic Energy Commission. And INVAP is a very innovative organization. Have you been down there?
It's coming up.
Okay. So those are very interesting people, at least the ones I used to work with. And they did a lot of innovative stuff. Yeah. And so, leveraging the law degree, I ended up practicing law for about 4 years when I came back from Argentina, where I had spent a year writing that book. And
but what compelled you to write that book? You could write on this world of knowledge, so many interesting topics. How do you dive into a project like that? At what point do you become convinced this is what I want to dedicate my time to?
Well, on my first book, on nuclear power in the developing world. Argentina was a case study.
Mm.
And I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, very provincial. I had no feel or understanding for Latin America at all, beyond what I'd seen on sort of 1950s TV shows, which was very limited. So when you get to Argentina, you immediately become fascinated. It's a highly sophisticated, looks like Paris. The population is predominantly European by origin, primarily Italian and Spanish by origin, and you can't help but be struck by this strange contrast between the intelligence, sophistication of the people, and the best of the best are as good as you get anywhere in the world, and yet the country kept tripping over these political hurdles and Peronism, and then the military, and then more Peronism, and then the military. And I just said, I would love to understand how this happened. And that was the thesis of that book, was why that happened.
Wow.
Yeah.
After you write these books, do you just get like a flurry of communications from people around the world who've always been interested in these topics and have something to say? Or
you get some. I think it's different now than what it was
because of the internet.
Yeah, the communications are much different
right.
than what we had back then. I remember, actually, it's funny, I don't remember which book it was, but I got some notice that we would like to put your book on the internet. And I thought, what's this? This is some kind of a scam. And I didn't realize, this would have been the greatest thing, right? If I had only been half intelligent to understand it.
Well, you've clearly learned from that mistake and applied forward thinking in all of your recommendations here, but we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Let's keep walking through. So you wrote the book, then...
Yeah, so then I practiced law for about 4 years at a firm called Covington and Burling here in Washington, D.C. But I was always still fascinated by these issues, and now it wasn't just nuclear, but it was energy more broadly. And frankly, national security and foreign policy were things I really loved, and I had gotten a course in college, got me all excited about that area. And so I got an opportunity to take a White House fellowship, and my first choice was the Pentagon. I didn't get that. My second choice was State Department. I didn't get that. So I was assigned to the Energy Department.
Yeah.
And the very first thing I worked on at the Energy Department was a thing you may or may not recall called the Pressler Amendment. Under the Pressler Amendment, the president had to certify every year that continued U.S. assistance to Pakistan would help, A, that Pakistan did not possess nuclear weapons, and B, that the aid will help continue that situation.
So what happened?
So what happened was the core competence of the U.S. Department of Energy is obviously nuclear technology in general and weapons technology in particular. And so the U.S. Department of Energy had an important voice in the National Security Council. Bob Gates was then the Deputy National Security Advisor, and he ran a deputies process. And at that point, the evidence of Pakistan's nuclear activities had become so overwhelming that the President George Herbert Walker Bush, was not able to certify. And so that was my introduction to nonproliferation from the government side. I had done a couple of internships actually at the State Department during college and law school, but that year at DOE was a great year. Admiral Watkins was a secretary, and I learned a lot. And so after a year there, I was actually recruited to join the National Security Council, and I was the first person who was assigned exclusively to work on nuclear nonproliferation in about 10 years.
Now, when you say join the Security Council, what does that actually mean?
Well, I was, technically speaking, as is very common at the National Security Council, I was detailed from the U.S. Department of Energy. Most of the people who work at the National Security Council, except at the highest levels, who are politicals, but most of the career people are assigned from other cabinet agencies. So I was assigned to the National Security Council, and at that time, General Brent Scowcroft was a national security advisor, who's still a dear friend and a hero of mine, and a great American. And we worked on incredible issues. It was the denuclearization of Iraq, and actually, I stayed in, initially I was in what we call the Defense Policy and Arms Control Directorate. It was led by a wonderful, brilliant man named Arnold Cantor, who sadly passed away from leukemia in 2010. And then I was one of only 3 people who survived the transition at the senior level from President Bush 41 to Clinton.
Why? Why did you survive the transition?
Well, it was like most things, serendipity. So because when President-elect then Clinton won, General Scowcroft called all the staff of the National Security Council together. It was all in this big room, room 208 of the old Executive Office Building. It used to be the ceremonial office of the Secretary of State when it was the Army State, War State Navy Building. And he said, President Bush will be fully constitutionally empowered until January 20th, and he will exercise those responsibilities. However, the transition team is coming. We have a constitutional democracy. They will be interviewing you, and you should be very open with them and tell them everything that they need to know. And in particular, if there are things that are consequential, you should make sure that they know about it if there are things we are trying to finish by January 20th. And if they object, I'm not saying what we will or will not do, but you should tell us. So eventually my time came around. They were interviewing all the staff. And I went down and I met Tony Lake, who was soon to be the National Security Advisor. And this was my interview. And I said what General Scowcroft had told us. And I said, we have one such issue. And he said, what's that? I said, we are trying very hard to negotiate a deal with the Soviet Union, I guess it still was. No, by this time it was Russia, to purchase 500 metric tons of highly enriched uranium out of the former Soviet weapons arsenal to blend it down to commercial reactor fuel to take it out of harm's way. It's 20,000 weapons worth.
This is like the megatons to megawatts program.
That's what it became known as later.
Yeah.
It wasn't yet. Now it's still like on the back of an
This is the
envelope.
origin story.
This is the origin.
Wait, so tell me again. This is a brilliant plan, by the way. How is it? What was the actual origin? Like, who conceived this idea?
So I guess JFK said after the Bay of Pigs that victory has many fathers, but defeat is an orphan. So I think there were a lot of people who had to do with it. I think the intellectual and kind of writing stuff and the articulation of it, I think probably as much as anybody was Tom Neff of MIT. And he did a lot of good work. But the thought process inside the government, now we're back in the Bush administration. We slipped off the transition, but we'll come back to it. At the time the Soviet Union broke up, people don't always remember now how worried we all were that we were going to end up with 4 nuclear weapon states out of the breakup of the Soviet Union: Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. Yeah. And so we dealt with a problem that's called the hemorrhage. And this was a potential hemorrhage of fissile materials like highly enriched uranium. Or
intellect, plutonium. Probably.
Intellect, brain drain, showing up in North Korea or wherever, and technology.
Yeah.
And how can we reap the prodigious carbon-free benefit conferred by nuclear energy without inadvertently, triggering some kind of nuclear holocaust? That's the challenge of our day.
It's a challenge, but on the other hand, I feel like when the expertise fully masters when the experts fully master the topic, there are pretty straightforward solutions. It might be complex, but it is not an insurmountable challenge to be able to both control proliferation and control weapons proliferation and encourage nuclear energy proliferation.
I think it's manageable. I mean, that's the case I make in the book. You got to be on your game. I think, in a way, the harder part of the equation is on the energy side, not the proliferation side, in the sense that there's actually been a lot of continuity in nonproliferation policy. There have been variations, but as you said, the solutions are pretty well known.
Right, and one of the ones that you brought up in the book was, tracking the fuel supply.
Yeah.
And the program. But to me, that seems like, all right, that pretty much solves it. Like if you're keeping track of the fuel supply, where it goes, how much is going where, you could be able to immediately detect if any of that fuel was being misused towards plutonium production.
Yeah, the immediate thing. I mean, I think the term of art that is often used is timely warning. That you should know of a diversion in sufficient time to take effective countermeasures.
Right.
And also, because a lot of on the proliferation side, a lot of the issues are like straight up national security / military / diplomatic issues. That's also, it's not easy, but this is a playbook that we have used time and again with Iran, with North Korea, and so forth. The thing that has been harder, I think, intellectually, is for people to come to the realization of the role that nuclear energy can play in climate change. And because of some of this sort of almost visceral views about nuclear dating back to the 1950s and the images from Godzilla, etc., there's been a sort of deep-seated anxiety, partly driven by the weapons issue, partly by radiation and stuff like that, that has, I think, colored the judgment of a lot of people that would be very helpful to persuade to join the cause, because if you are worried, as I am worried, about catastrophic climate change, we really need this.
I want to dedicate a lot of time to that discussion. Before we do, though, I just want to make sure that since I only have you here for a period of time, I capture your full story.
Oh.
Deputy Secretary of Energy.
Right.
How long was that? That was under Stephen Chu, and then
yeah.
So, and then you led the transition. You were the acting Secretary of Energy
for a whole month.
For a whole month between Chu and Movies.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Can you just maybe touch upon some of the highlights during your time there as well?
So actually, I had only been at the Department of Energy a few months. I got a call from the then Deputy National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, and he said, we need you to go to Vienna to negotiate with the Iranians on the Tehran research reactor situation, because obviously the Iran nuclear proliferation challenge, all the centrifuges they were building, was the huge national security issue of the day. And I said, well, what do you have Secretary of State Bill Burns for? And they said, no, Bill did the Geneva talks. These are supposed to be technical talks.
Yep.
And we are concerned that they're not going to send somebody of stature.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted them, the Iranians, to send Ali Akbar Salehi. They ended up not sending him, but the idea was not to give the Iranians a protocol excuse to lowball the negotiation. So actually, I was sent to Vienna. The then head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammad al-Baradei, Nobel Peace Laureate, was hosting these talks, and the French and the Russians and the Iranians and ourselves were in this negotiation in which we actually agreed what we call ad referendum in diplomatic terms, to ship out a significant amount of low-enriched uranium fuel the Iranians had already created in exchange for foreign supply of 20% enriched uranium to go into the Tehran research reactor, which was a source of medical radioisotopes. And what the ad referendum means is the negotiators in Vienna all agreed to this, but they each needed to get the approval of their home governments in capitals. The US approved, the French approved, the Russians approved, but in Tehran, where there was this big tension between Larijani and that group and Ahmadinejad and that group, this would have been viewed as a win for Ahmadinejad. So the people you might otherwise have considered moderates in the system, my understanding is, basically tanked the deal back in Tehran. So that was one thing. But again, like many things, you end up doing things you don't expect. I spent a lot of time on resilience, and energy became front and center.
Resilience, grid resilience? What resilience?
That too. We had a thing called the Electricity Sector Coordinating Committee. We had CEOs coming periodically to talk about resilience in general, resilience against storms, cybersecurity. I spent an enormous time on cybersecurity. You know, we had this experience where we would meet every few months, and I got I got this phone call from Tom Kuhn, who's the head of Edison Electric Institute. He says, there's a big storm coming, and so we may have to reschedule our meeting. And then he said, but actually, maybe it would make sense. We haven't done this before, but this is such a big storm that we're not leaving it to the mid-career people. We're actually having CEO calls. Why don't you jump on the call? And this is what became Superstorm Sandy. And so I said, sure. And so after I jumped on the call, and we had, we said, how can we help you from a federal perspective and Department of Energy? We had certain capabilities. Of course, we were part of a much larger network with FEMA and other parts of the federal government. And after I was on the call, I said, well, why don't you have Secretary Chu on the next call? And so he did. Secretary Chu joined the next call. Then I got a call before what was going to be the third call, and I guess I got a call from the White House, now that I think about it, and they said, would you mind if the president joined the call?
Whoa.
I said, no, I think we could probably accommodate that. So
yeah, we don't want another Katrina situation happening. This time the president gets involved.
No, the president was on top of this thing. He was on top of this. I'll tell you one more story about him on this. So he gets on the call, and we're talking about it, and they were saying something about, I'm not sure because there's actually snow in West Virginia. I'm not sure we can get these, bucket trucks driven through. And he said, well, Poneman will take care of that. I go, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do about the snow in West Virginia? But
you just got demoted to truck driver.
Yeah. What I found out subsequently is in up at PSE&G, the utility up in
I just met with Ralph Izzo just the other day.
Ralph's terrific.
Yeah, I didn't realize he had a physics background. Super smart guy.
Yes. No, he's a Columbia physics background. So Ralph's brilliant. So I went up to visit Ralph, actually, and I was touring around their control room, and they told me the story of their side of that conference call. Somebody walks in the middle of the conference call, and they go, who's that doing an Obama impersonation? Because the president was on the call. And,
my God.
So, but here's the interesting thing. So the president was having, I think it was daily sessions. Some of them were in person. A lot of them were video conference. And one of the earliest ones, he said, after the preservation of life and limb, my highest priority is restoring power. Mm-hmm. The next day,
by the way, that is the preservation of life and limb also.
Indeed. Hospitals, absolutely. So the next day, I think Craig Fugate was the head of FEMA at the time. And FEMA was largely staffed by sort of career people, GS-14s, GS-15s, mid-level people. But he actually had all the deputies of the cabinet agencies participating show up for this meeting. And we're all convoked. Craig's a very forceful personality. And he kicks off the meeting at 9 a.m. or whatever time it was. He walks in. He said, you heard the president. You know what to do. Now go do it. Walks out. I mean, he had a presence.
Yeah. That's a very New Jersey attitude.
Yeah. So about 5-10 minutes later, we're sitting around the table. I had been trying to get bucket trucks from California.
Get out of here.
Yeah. Flown to the East Coast.
On what, like C-135? How do you get that?
I think it's C5.
C5.
But in any event, I was being told, no, it's much more efficient. You tie them down to flatbed trucks and you drive them. I go like, what? And so, there's 58 approvals. And after Fugate walks out in this brief dramatic session, I said, now how about those bucket trucks? And I won't say who, I don't even remember the name, but somebody said, well, what about that? I said, did you just hear the president? And within a few hours,
Amazing.
They were flying. And I talked, and I got to give credit. This is where all those meetings and the trust you develop with the CEOs and this, what I told you about this electricity sector coordinating committee really paid off. Because I talked to Ted Craver, who was at that time the CEO of Edison Electric International, and I think I had talked to Tony Early as well. I think he was out in PG&E, and they had these trucks, and they said, like, well, we had these trucks, but what if we have a forest fire? And I said, I'll fly them back. Which didn't happen, but I mean, it shows you the coin of the realm. When the president says get it done,
Okay.
people get it done.
All right, so now we're going to transition to climate. How come that never happened with climate change? How come there wasn't a get it done moment and the same attitude taken towards, I mean, listen, what I think should be done is, that level of attitude goes to the national labs, build us a new cheap type of nuclear reactor. Like, how come it's not a get it done moment for cheap nuclear power?
I think it is. I think it should be. I'm sorry to say, it has not resonated. With nuclear weapons, you have Hiroshima, Nagasaki, mushroom clouds, Cuban Missile Crisis. Everyone gets it. It's present. It's palpable. It's real. Climate change. It's a little bit more like the boiling frog metaphor, right?
I get it, but that still doesn't explain why a leader can't still say, maybe it doesn't even have to be at the presidential level, but anyone with enough authority and enough budget should be able to say, get it done. And you don't need the whole public to come on board with it. You need 1,000 extremely dedicated, well-financed scientists, engineers who make it their mission for the next 2 years to just get it done.
Well, you might even call it a Rickover moment, because Rickover had that kind of attitude. You need backing. I mean, the numbers in nuclear are substantial. You also need innovative thinking. I agree with the recent MIT study. We have to have not incremental. We have to have a dramatic.
Right, and so the MIT study essentially went through the economics of nuclear power, what it takes to decarbonize the world. One of the suggestions they recommended was even this like shipyard building type mentality. So, but once again, that is something that is within the scope of a government get it done mandate to build a shipyard on a Navy site somewhere and just start pumping out ocean-bound nuclear reactors if they wanted to. If they wanted to.
I have to say, I think there has been too much ambivalence to support that kind of effort. Let me make a contrast. In 1939, the United States produced 3,000 airplanes. By 1945, we had produced 300,000 airplanes. And we got up to a rate of about 100,000.
Part of the rich history of Long Island, I'm going to throw out there,
Indeed.
where I grew up.
Indeed. So that's to your point. When there's a get it done moment, this country can get it done.
Yeah.
Time and again we've
Time and again.
But that moment has not ever really worked, and I think the reason why is because even within the now pretty broad swath of Americans who believe climate change is an existential threat, there's still a lot of anxiety about nuclear. And I think that has blocked people from embracing it and doing the kind of get it done Rickover.
Can I offer a counter thesis to something you said earlier about where this anxiety comes from? You tied it to nuclear weapons, you tied it to radiation. So now I've met with well over 1,200 experts in the nuclear energy space. We've interviewed 100, you're the 174th we'll put on the podcast.
Wow.
And the thing that I am noticing, which just like does not seem to be ever mentioned amongst the nuclear community, is that it is not the fear of radiation. It is not the connection with weapons that creates this anxiety. It is literally how the nuclear community talks about nuclear, how they say the word safety every 5 seconds.
I'm with you.
Talking about safety scares the shit out of people.
I know.
Giant 6-foot thick concrete aircraft-proof domes say that what's inside is more dangerous than if an airplane was to fly into a skyscraper, which is not true. I mean, it's a nuclear community, how they overemphasize safety, how they talk about it, how they're defensive about the technology, how every time someone challenges them, they have to say, we need to come up with a solution for waste for 1,000,000 years, instead of saying, it's never hurt anybody, it's not a problem, just forget about it. It's all of these things that are giving people the anxiety.
Yeah. So actually, I agree with you. And the one that drives me crazy, you never see, I won't say any name of a company, you never see an airplane company advertising their safe airplanes, right?
I know.
But why do we have to call it accident-tolerant fuels?
I know.
This is insane.
I
Like,
know.
what marketing school did they go to? No
I know.
offense. I don't know who came up with the idea. I even said, I'll let you keep ATF, but just call them advanced technology fuels.
Right.
But I couldn't agree with you more. We are terrible as an industry at telling our story well. It's a sad thing. I mean, you know this. All the nuclear waste, the 80,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel, which I redubbed used nuclear fuel in my time at Energy, would fill one football field 7 yards deep.
Or could create 1,000 years worth of energy, if repurposed. I mean, it's just like, but instead what we do is we tell the public, don't worry, we'll take care of it. We're going to bury it away for 1,000,000 years. And what that does is that convinces the public that it is so disproportionately dangerous, it needs to be buried for 1,000,000 years.
Yeah.
So no matter how many logical arguments we make about its relative safety to other toxic chemicals, that doesn't matter, because what the public reads is our actions. Right? We allocate, I mean, how many billions of dollars, I'm going to push some hot button issues here, but how many billions of dollars have we spent on the Hanford cleanup site when there's so many other toxic issues? Flint, Michigan. I mean, so what we're saying is essentially that people are at more risk from the stuff that we've already cleaned up 1,000,000 times over at Hanford than the Michigan people are from lead in their water. That's the value that we're projecting, and that's how dangerous we are convincing the public is of nuclear.
And one of the implications of this phenomenon is that we collectively end up overdoing it in every dimension.
Overdoing it.
So, for example, there is material that is not that toxic out at the Hanford Reservation, but the standard got articulated some time ago. The containment has to be as good as glass. So some material that would be lower level waste that in another place in the country would be satisfactorily put in caulking or some grout kind of material, they got to make into glass, which is infinitely more expensive. And so then the cost grows like topsy. You become decades over schedule.
And this is all tied to ALARA also, because ALARA is this concept of as low as reasonably achievable ALARA, which essentially forces people beyond, it says as low as reasonably achievable, but it forces people to standards far beyond what's reasonable. And it's created this culture within the nuclear community of, even after you've crossed the threshold of where this no longer poses a hazard to human health, they go 1,000 times further in every metric, and like you said, creates an infinite expense.
Yeah, I know, and it's killing us. I mean, as again, the MIT study cites, all these other costs of the other forms of energy are plummeting, and nuclear is going this way, and this is part of the reason why.
But how come? So you're involved in the industry. You've got stature. How come there isn't a come to Jesus moment for the industry itself, where the leaders call everyone together and say, "Listen, our intentions were good with the safety culture, with ALARA, with trying to protect everybody, but the result over the last 10 years or 20 years is that we've worked ourselves out of business, and we've made the world on net less safe because we forced people to other pollutants, other energy sources because we're too expensive."
Those conversations do occur, but I often find we end up talking to ourselves. And I think what we need to do is get to a wider community, right? And because we always find ourselves in these dinner conversations where we're all agreeing with each other that this is a horrible thing, but somehow it doesn't get translated into actions that then propagate across the broader population.
Yeah. Let's talk about your book a little bit. I found it to be incredible. Like I said, it's like a series of policy papers, and I love how you name names, you put numbers in there, and then you draw actionable conclusions about what should be done. I mean, that is the best way to write a book, in my opinion.
Thank you.
What inspired this book?
It's this obsession.
Double Jeopardy. We should call it Double Jeopardy. They can find it on Amazon, right?
Oh yeah.
Double Jeopardy on Amazon. Dan Poneman. Buy it now. Now. We're going to take a 2-second pause. Buy it now.
Thank you.
Okay.
This is the obsession I had going back to John Glenn.
Yeah.
This is the obsession I've always had. Can we reap the benefits of the peaceful use of the atom, as Dwight Eisenhower so well articulated back December 8th, 1953, and still reduce the risks of proliferation? And I think the answer is an overwhelming yes.
Yeah.
And it's a funny thing because this is my 4th book. I don't know if I apart from having a few friends over, did anything about any other book that I wrote. But I really want people to think about the issues here, because I would love to contribute to this hey moment. We got to change this.
Yeah.
And I really feel like we're right on the bubble, because on the one hand, and you know this so well, we're losing perfectly well operating reactors today. We're down from 104 to 99, 98, and a lot more at risk. On the other hand, there's some incredibly exciting things happening in new technology with advanced generation reactors. We're very excited. I have to say, we never finished the narrative. I'm now running a nuclear fuel company, but we're going to start building centrifuge machines in Ohio.
Awesome.
That's going to create a new flavor, so to speak, of enriched uranium, because typically you have enrichment in the 235 isotope of up to 4 or 5% to create steam, drive turbines, and generate electricity. And if you go up to 90%, now you've got enough highly enriched uranium concentrated to either make naval reactor fuel or a bomb. But in between, you get 19.75% so-called high-assay low-enriched uranium, and that's the fuel of choice of many of these advanced reactor developers.
Because it allows you to use a different combination of materials, fuel, coolant, moderator in the core to enable these advanced fuel cycles and create the higher density that you would need in order to make that a reality.
You get higher density, and so this is the
so you guys are investing in this right now. So you're assuming this is coming down the pipeline?
Actually, what's happened is our company has signed a contract with the United States Department of Energy. It's a cost share, and the department is putting in 80%, and the company's putting in 20%.
That's a good deal.
And in 3 years, we're going to start producing modest quantities of high-assay low-enriched uranium that then could be tested for use by these advanced reactor developers.
Amazing. What is there still some of the highly enriched stuff from down-blended weapons to use just in case, or to give some of these newer companies some stuff to even start off with even before these centrifuges come online?
During the Cold War, the United States made a lot of highly enriched uranium, and there's still, I can't tell you how much. If I could tell you, I couldn't tell you, right? Because the numbers are obviously...
This podcast would just disappear offline.
Exactly. But downblending has been a source of getting low enriched uranium.
And how do you get it up to that high from a technical perspective? We don't have to go too much into it now, but how are the centrifuges actually different than the centrifuges today?
Well, our particular centrifuges?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, the context is, for most of the Cold War, we did not use centrifuges at all.
You used the gaseous process.
We used the so-called gaseous diffusion process. And ironically, we were talking about megatons and megawatts. In 2013, two things happened. Number one, the megatons and megawatts program ended. And number two, because Fukushima had so annihilated demand for enrichment, because the Japanese shut down 54 reactors, the Germans shut down 10 reactors, the last of those old gaseous diffusion plants at Paducah, Kentucky shut down. So the United States, which when I started for John Glenn had like 90% of the world market, everything outside of the Soviet bloc, as we used to call it. When I was working for Bush 41, we had 40%. When I started in 2009 at Energy, we had 25%. In 6 months, we went from 25% to 4% of the world market and no production.
Whoa.
So now, to your point, the new technology, they're very large centrifuges, larger than most other centrifuges, and they spin at very high speeds, and they are much more efficient. They don't, it used to take 3 power plants to drive the gaseous diffusion plants. And so the cost was astronomical. So now we have a much more efficient design, and we're very excited to deploy these. It's just 16 machines in the first instance, but it's a start. It puts us back in the game.
Yeah, well, I think you guys should be investing even further, looking further down the line, because my thesis is that it will be impossible to solve our climate issues without an incredible scale up of nuclear energy, and that incredible scale up of nuclear energy is going to require a lot of fuel.
we are in violent agreement. And the very sober, very analytically solid International Energy Agency basically says we need 2x nuclear, even to come close to the 2-degree target, which I think is too high. Right?
Way too high. Okay, that comes up in your book. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Because I agree with so many of the things that you wrote about, but I guess this is maybe me picking a little bit, but the tone around the Paris Agreement, I have a little bit of a disagreement with.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the Paris Agreement, essentially, I understand people claim that is like a stepping stone towards what we need to accomplish.
Yeah.
But I think it is so far off from what we need to accomplish. It is uninspirational and perhaps even counterproductive. If we hit that 2 first of all, with the Paris Agreement, and I think most people lose this thought, all of these things are we want to hit 1.5 degree or 2 degree, whatever it is, by 2100. But what the Paris Agreement does not account for is that if we still have carbon in the air, excess carbon in the air, above 300 parts per million at that point, even if we have reduced the rate at which we are adding carbon to the air, 2100, that's fine, we're at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, whatever it is. 2101, we're higher than that. 2102, we're higher than that. We're going to keep adding heat until we've removed all the excess carbon dioxide from the air. And the Paris Agreement doesn't even touch upon that point. And 2 degrees is a freaking climate holocaust.
I know. I mean, see, the IPCC report came out after I wrote this book.
Right.
But the one statistic in that just blew my mind, because I spent a fair time looking at this, coral reefs. Yeah. At 2 degrees, you lose 99%. And it might be worse.
Oh, the oceans are gone. We've lost the oceans.
I can't even.
We've lost the oceans.
But I'm too much of an optimist to accept that.
Be an optimist in that maybe we can save part of the planet at this point. But we've lost the oceans.
Yeah. But 1.5 degrees, you still lose 80%. You saw what happened in 2016 at the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, to watch those time-lapse photography.
They're gone. Goodbye, coral. Go scuba diving now if you want.
I do, and this is what pains me. And I can tell. I mean, you want to say.
And by the way, that's just a harbinger of other things to come as well.
It's just a harbinger, and of course, you're talking about like removing whole phyla from because the
ecosystem collapse.
Huge
I know.
Ecosystem, and think of all the people who live on the fisheries.
Yeah.
And how the people and the protein that we all survive on. It's just horrible, and that's why I do think we really need more intellectual honesty. And I think conversations like the one you're having here are great, because the people who actually say they care about the environment, a lot of them still have this allergy, antipathy, visceral negativity about nuclear.
Listen, but those people are not true climate heroes. They're not true climate advocates, because and you're going to see a lot of this, and we already even see it, not to get too political too quick, but we see it with the Green New Deal too. People are using climate to advocate for many things that they are, that is the most important thing to them. Climate is just an opportunity for them to broaden a support base, for them to loop in whatever their issue as well. But a lot of this happens with the intermittent sources, the renewable sources, where they think that they can, or they claim that they can solve the whole problem, when really what they're doing is they're just leveraging the emotions around climate change to carve out a bigger slice of the pie, rather than looking at the problem of climate change and saying, what is the actual solution to this thing?
Well, in this respect, I had just yesterday, I was really eager to meet. I just had a very good conversation with this gentleman I mentioned before, Varun Sivara. Mm-hmm. He's a passionate advocate for solar power, but he's also intellectually honest and rigorous. Yeah. And his book, Taming the Sun, is terrific. And it basically says, the first 10% or so in terms of introduction to solar, that's easy pickings. Yeah. That's but the higher, the higher the penetration you get of the intermittent sources, the higher the cost of them. Yeah. Battery storage ain't the solution, and especially for seasonal shifts. That's right. And the last part is, he believes that for solar to realize its full potential, you need a significant deployment of flexible sources of dispatchable power like nuclear.
That's right.
So there is an intellectually honest argument that can be made that embraces this. Look, I spent 5.5 years as Deputy Secretary of Energy speaking about an all-of-the-above energy strategy. I believe it. I mean, we need everything we got. Because as you said, Paris, I don't know if I would say it's counterproductive, but it, like all political documents, half a loaf, whatever you say, it doesn't get us where we need to be. And if you assume perfect compliance with all of those independent, national, determined contributions, you're still a country mile off, and they're already way off track, as of course they would inevitably be from their own promises.
Yeah, and there's no enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
No, to me it's like, what inspires a country to act is a vision of success. Like with JFK, let's go to the moon, right?
Yeah.
He didn't say, let's get part of the way there and then come up with another plan at that point.
Yeah.
Or he didn't say, let's get to the point where we've got rockets blowing up halfway on approach to the moon with people inside, and then we'll get to the moon eventually. That's what the Paris Climate is.
Yeah.
There's going to be untold devastation even if we hit those targets in Paris. Sorry, that's my picking a fight.
Actually, this goes back to an earlier part of our conversation. That is why if you can find a tool like a carbon tax that institutionally puts a thumb on the scales, that can drive things. I mean, natural gas obviously emits half the greenhouse gas emissions of coal, and it's elbowing coal out, not because people are saying it's much cleaner,
no, it's
but
economics.
Because it's cheaper.
Economics.
Right? So if you can, and like the megaton to megawatts, if we can find ways to leverage market forces. Here's another example, and I cite it in the book. You can get a combination of things. People got really afraid about the hole in the ozone.
Yeah.
George Shultz was Secretary of State. Big debate between his advisors. The economic advisors saying, don't do anything, you're going to destroy our economy. And the environmentalists say, do something, you're going to have a hole in the ozone.
Yeah.
And they negotiated the Montreal Convention. They obliterated the CFCs, and the economy grew like topsy. So this is a completely false dichotomy between, prosperity and climate. Obviously, as you all know, they're integrally related and positively correlated. We have a cleaner planet, we're going to be a much more prosperous planet. Can you imagine?
So much more prosperous from two perspectives. So not only from the health of people, the safety of people, are they able to produce more and more things to grow. But if we are able, and listen, it's going to take more than just a tax. We need to bring down the cost of nuclear so significantly. But the further that you bring down the cost of any energy source, which we're going to have to do to pull all that carbon out of the air, that means that energy itself is cheaper, and that itself drives prosperity.
Of course. I mean, you've seen these Sankey diagrams from the Lawrence Livermore lab. I got one in here.
Yeah.
55% of our energy goes out the windows, up the smokestack.
Yeah.
Totally wasted.
Yeah.
Totally wasted.
Yeah.
That's not elegant.
I know. Before we wrap up, I'm going to read off we don't have to talk about them right now, but I do want to just mention some of the things that this book covers, just so people can get a taste of it. We go through some of the history of nuclear. We talk about climate. Like I said before, one of the things I love so much are you name names, you put numbers in there, and you always end with a policy recommendation. And so it talks about safety, security, low carbon energy sources, investing in innovation. You brought up ARPA-E in there, which was one of my favorite programs that the government works on.
Yeah.
Restoring U.S. nuclear leadership, how to improve economics. I mean, it's just, I wish I could have just talked to you about this for hours, and we'll go to lunch and we actually will talk about this for hours. But as we wrap up here, I want you to leave with a final note of why this is important to you and where you see a potential optimistic future for the U.S., for the world, for energy and beyond.
I believe that we all have an obligation to the succeeding generations. We're custodians of this precious planet. And I am horrified by the IPCC reports and what I see with my own eyes happening before us. The coral reefs are only the most visible, dramatic element, maybe not even. The ice sheets that are shrinking, and I so fear that not even our grandchildren, our children will not be able to enjoy the kind of planet that we have. But the optimistic point is, I think we are at that moment. I think people are starting to get what you're saying they need to get. And I think with just a little more muscle and focus and some of the very exciting ideas happening in the advanced generation community, we can make better, smarter, cheaper, smaller, and more politically accepted nuclear reactors, small ones, deployed in distributed configurations. And I think that's the hope for the future. And if we do that, and if we can get out of our own way of misarguing the case, as you so eloquently described it a few minutes ago, I see a bright future.
Dan Poneman, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.